So to kick off the better session, as it shall henceforth be known, we have Anna Stewart from Griffith University, and she's going to be presenting on assessing the life course overlaps among mental health, child protection and criminal justice system contacts, similarities and differences by gender and Indigenous status. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much. I think that must be one of the longest titles I've ever done. Sorry about that. And I'm not going to actually now cross it out and put an even longer title, which is actually what I'm going to talk about. But okay, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Anna Stewart. I am in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, Griffith Criminology Institute up in Brisbane, where I've been for some considerable number of years. The work that I'm going to talk to about today is actually part of a bigger project that's been funded by the ARC and also extends on a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 25 years on administrative data linkage. So what I'm going to talk about today is, I don't have one of those slides that had those 10 points that say what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to start by talking about briefly about the bigger project, about the data, the bigger project, and the sort of philosophy behind it, and then go to the specific questions about looking at the overlap between these three systems and examining them by gender and Indigenous status. So that's what I'm going to do today. So straight into, I hope, the data. So this is what I call the Queensland Linkage Project. What we have managed to do is link administrative data from Queensland from a whole range of administrative systems, in fact 13 databases, not just the criminal justice databases, but also health databases. So what we actually now have is longitudinal population-based data from 0 to 31 years, from 0 to 30 years, and from 0 to 25 years. So this is longitudinal data, and it has every contact that someone in Queensland who was born in one of those years has had with any of these systems that are sitting up there, and they are all linked together at an individual level so that you can follow people over time, over their life course. So very much thinking developmental life course criminology. So we have Queensland births, deaths and marriages, so we know whether or not they got married, we know whether or not they've got children or not. We've got the child protection system, both as a victim and a maltreater. We've got the Queensland Police System Service, very much looking at the youth diversion that comes through from Queensland Police. We've got both youth and adult court appearances. We've got corrections, community and custodial, domestic violence protection orders, which are civil orders, not criminal orders, both as a respondent and agreed. And Queensland Health Hospital admissions for mental health issues, mental health contacts and emergency department admissions. It took me years to get the ethics approvals, linkages, etc., of these done. They were all linked together a year or so ago, so we're only really just starting to explore this data. So the work that I'm going to talk to today is very much the initial stuff. I mean, looking at all these really amazing statistical analyses and going, oh, I've just got, a few t-tests and crosstabs. So, but anyway, we've got that. So what we actually have is just over 250,000 individuals, and we have more than 2.5 million contacts with these various systems over the period of their life. These data are all stored in the Social Analytics Lab, which is a secure data facility at Griffith University. It's air-gapped, and it has, it's built to ASIO standards to ensure that we can actually store highly sensitive data. So the last time we linked this data, we were linked under an ARC-funded project, and that particular project is understanding the relationship between mental illness and offending, implications for crime prevention and management of mentally ill offenders. And I must acknowledge my chief investigators, myself, Susan Dennis and Troy Allard, who presented at the first session, I think, at this conference, project manager who actually did a lot of the work around the linkage, and my partner organisations, Queensland Government Statisticians Office, who actually did our linkage, Queensland Health, Queensland Police Service. I've just got Youth Justice and Child Safety because since I started this one, they've changed departments about 3 times. So they are the organisations, but they're in different departments from when we started. So why do I do this work? Why do data linkage? Why do data linkage? across systems, because our government systems are siloed, and we need to understand how these silos overlap. I mean, if you actually talk to anybody on the front line, or I was in a child case death review committee, what you know is that for these individuals, there are lots of overlaps across these systems, but we don't actually have the empirical evidence about it. We do this data to understand the individual development over the life course, and these longitudinal administrative data gives us a proxy for some of the very expensive longitudinal research methodologies to understand how individuals accrue cumulative disadvantage. And this is becoming a more and more theoretical concept that's coming through the literature at the moment, talking about how, you know, the more times you actually come into contact with the system, the more disadvantaged you are. It's just a sheer matter of number. Identifying prevention and intervention points within the systems, preferably early in the pathways, and also recognising the challenges to professionals working in the silos. So police working with child protection matters, child protection workers trying to work with police around criminal matters, etc., etc. So that's why we do the data linkage. And why the focus on mental health. My interest in mental health really comes around the policy of deinstitutionalisation of the mental ill. So we've had a huge reduction in psychiatric institutional beds, as you can see. The rationale for moving people out of institutions and into the community was to reduce the stigmas associated with mental health, to increase the visibility of mentally ill people in the community, and to focus on mental health, not mental illness. And of course, at this time in the 60s and 70s, there were a whole range of new pharmacological options to try and help people manage their illnesses. However, the implementation of this policy lacked resources, trained staff, adequate, etc., etc. I've just gone too fast. So what the result of this poor implementation of this policy was an increase in family in poverty and family stress as families tried to cope with having mentally ill people living with them, increase in homeless, and the criminalisation, and I put criminalisation with a question mark of the mentally ill. You know, around, is this about increased visibility for minor criminal offence, public order offences, criminal sanctions for behaviours related to their mental illness, or even the prisons as dumping grounds for the mentally ill because we do not have enough institutional beds for them. So the research questions I'm going to look at is really about system overlaps today. So I'm going to look about whether or not there is an overlap between child maltreatment, mental illness and offending. I'm going to examine by gender and Indigenous status, two extraordinarily key factors we know within the criminal justice system. And then I'm going to have a look at what comes first, child maltreatment or offending, what comes first, mental illness and offending, to try and look at the life course development of these into mental illness. So that green button doesn't, health warning. Actually, after some of the presentations I've seen, I think I'm pathetic. I could take that health warning, this has got virtually no numbers in it at all, and whoa. I've seen more numbers in the last 2 days than I've seen for a long time, and I like numbers. Okay, so what I am focusing on is the 99 population data. So this is going to 25. The reason we focus on this one is because it wasn't until the early 1990s, so 93, 94, that mental health hospital admission data was electronically collected. So it goes back to when they were 3 or 4, but if I was using a later cohort, I wouldn't have data that goes back that far. So they're 25 years old at the data of linkage. I had 269 deaths in that data, and I've excluded them from the purposes of this analysis. I've defined offenders as people who, between the age of 10, so both youth offenders and adult offenders, who have at least one finalised guilty court appearance. So one. They might have many, but they've got at least one. Mentally ill. And it's been interesting because we had some talks yesterday about mentally ill. Mentally ill includes everybody who has a hospital admission for a mental illness. So this includes things like substance abuse disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, not just psychosis. So often when we start talking about mentally ill, we are thinking about psychotic illnesses, whereas for us, this is the whole range of ICD codes that are associated with mental illness. So as long as they've had one hospital admission, and this is a very conservative measure, mainly because our community base doesn't actually have diagnostic categories on it, between the ages of 5 when the system started and 25, they're included in the database. And maltreated children are actually, again, using a more conservative measure, having at least one substantiated child protection notification. Don't include data from the mental health courts. Just quick sideline, mental health courts in Queensland decide if you're unsound mind when they committed the offence and whether or not you're fit for trial. It has very, very small numbers going through it, and if you were found fit for child, you go back into my adult court data. So of the 290 cases that went through in a year, 90 of them have gone back into the adult, back into our data. So it's a very small number. So summary statistics. So I'm just going to go through each of the databases and give you a brief overview of what percentage of the population actually falls into each of these categories. So in 1990, we had 45,000 individuals who were born in Queensland. So using born in Queensland to give me the life course of them through to 25. 6.4% of the population were admitted at least once to a hospital for a mental health issue, from 5 to 25. Interesting. We see, once. As Auntie Anne was talking, I was thinking, I've got those awful statistics that she was going on about Indigenous overrepresentation across all of our systems. But you can see here quite clearly that 1 in 5 Indigenous Australians, Queenslanders, had a hospital admission as opposed to only 6% of non-Indigenous Australians. When we go to child maltreatment, again, we had 5.8% had been substantiated at least once for maltreatment. Again, we see the significant overrepresentations of Indigenous Queenslanders in these data, especially female Indigenous, even though we don't generally have a gender difference. Oh yes, have I been told off? Yeah, that's because I can read. Sorry about that, everybody, if you couldn't hear me down the back. Not only did we look at whether or not that had ever been substantiated, but we also know that Indigenous children have far more substantiations than non-Indigenous children. Youth offending, so I've divided up, I'll quickly look at youth and adult and then I'll put the two of them together. 3.2 of the population were found guilty at once through the youth courts. Remember, in Queensland we have a huge diversion through police diversion. Far more kids are diverted, and those kids who are diverted never actually come back into the system. So by the time they get to court, something like 90% of all kids get a diversion on their first appearance, either a caution or a youth justice conference. But of those that come back into the system, they end up in the court system. So again, we see the overrepresentation of Indigenous Queenslanders. Go backwards. And the other thing we see is the very few non-Indigenous females who end up. Remember, these are populations. So this is 22% of all female Indigenous Queenslanders have actually had a youth justice court appearance by the time they're 17-year-old. And 41 of all young males, Indigenous young males, so that's everybody. Even worse when you go into the adult system. The other thing, Indigenous children had significantly more appearances than non-Indigenous children. We go into the adult system, we've got 24% of our population, about 1 in 4 actually have by the time they're 25, have some contact with the adult court system. And when we look at that, we see the outstanding statistic there is actually the few non-Indigenous Queenslanders that turn up. Well over 80% of Indigenous males have actually had contact with the criminal justice system. When I first got these statistics, I always was really freaked out about them. But in actual fact, one of the reasons why we really struggle to get justices of the peace in Indigenous communities is because very few of them don't have a criminal history. Interestingly enough, of those kids that appeared in court, only 19 of them in the youth courts did not also appear in the adult court. So I've added them both together, but remembering most of those appeared that under the age of 17 have actually also appeared in the adult court. Ever imprisoned, which is, a proxy for seriousness of offending. 1.7% of the population had actually been sentenced to prison, either youth detention or an adult prison. However, what we see is 1 in 4 Indigenous males have actually been sentenced to prison by the time they're 25. Again, exacerbating, and also talking about the penetration of imprisonment in Indigenous communities and the fact that they know very few people who haven't been to prison. 75% of young people sentenced to a youth detention were later sentenced to an adult prison too. So I don't think youth detention is working as a diversion or actually in any way preventing kids from moving on into the adult system. So back to question 1, what are the overlaps amongst the child protection, mental health and criminal court system? These are our summary statistics that you just saw. 70% of individuals had no contact, 5.8 of individuals had a child protection substantiation, and of them, I added those together and had them on the notes, and I'm not going to be 42% actually had contact with the adult court system. Of people with mental health admission, another 42% actually had contact with the court system. So there's a high level of overlap. However, when you start looking backwards of people who actually offended, we find that the majority of people who offended had not had contact with the child protection mental health systems. However, when we look across gender and Indigenous status, what we see is that for Indigenous females, they were actually more likely not to have contact. They were more likely to have had contact than not have contact with one of the other systems. We see that in the overlap group, Indigenous males and females were 11% likely to have been in the overlap as opposed to 3% in the non. When we look at child protection, 24% as opposed to 7%. And when we look at the mental health doesn't show, except of course when you add the overlaps back in, it does show the same gender difference and race difference. When we go to prisons, we see that in actual fact the majority of people in prison actually have had contact with one of the other two systems. And again, when we split this by Indigenous status and males, we see that Indigenous females, 24% of them had not had contact with one of the other two systems, whereas 50% of non-Indigenous males had not had contact with the other two systems. Particularly evident between Indigenous and non-Indigenous was the overrepresentation of Indigenous kids in the child protection system. In the overlap, we had quite a different pattern with Indigenous females having 30% and then Indigenous males and non-Indigenous females, 20% were in the overlap. And it's 20% of all prisoners and 10% of non-Indigenous males. When we actually add those two together, we actually start to see a gender difference in imprisonment, with more females having contact with the mental health system than males. So what comes first, child maltreatment or offending? What comes first, mental illness or offending? Child maltreatment and offending I've done a lot of work on, and we're pretty clear that of people who have maltreatment before they go on the offend, which is a majority of them, 23% of people with no prior maltreatment history go on to offend, as opposed to 52% of people with a prior maltreatment history. So we've got a strong risk factor through child maltreatment, and also that when we go backwards, offenders with a prior maltreatment history offend more frequently and are more likely to be sentenced to imprisonment. When I came to try and do the work with the mental illness, because you can go into hospital at any time, unlike the child maltreatment, which you age out of at 17, my brain really had a lot of problems trying to work out. However, I mean, it's clear that 23% of people with a mental illness offended, whereas half of people without a mental illness with a mental illness. And for mentally ill offenders, 70% had their first hospital admission before their first court appearance, and 80% had their first hospital admission before their first prison sentence. So we do seem to have a risk factor there. Summary, most offenders have no contact with the child protection and or mental health system, but this is not true for Indigenous females. Indigenous offenders are more likely than non-Indigenous offenders to experience child maltreatment. Most imprisoned offenders had contact with child protection and all the mental health systems. Indigenous prisoners were more likely than non-Indigenous prisoners to have a child protection background. Female prisoners were more likely than male prisoners to have a mental health one. Mental health hospital admissions and child protection substantiations are risk factors for offending. Offenders with mental health illness offend more frequently, more likely to be sentenced to imprisonment. Same with offenders with a child protection history. So what 4 take-home messages? Both child maltreatment prevention and mental health treatment programs can be considered crime prevention programs. Strong evidence of cumulative disadvantage, especially when we start looking at the frequencies across the systems, across the life course, particularly amongst Indigenous Australians. These individuals seem to be entrenched in our systems, not just our criminal justice system, and major interventions like multi-systemic evidence-based interventions seem to be most appropriate to try and deal with this cumulative disadvantage. However, we need to recognise that child welfare, health and criminal justice all have different and competing philosophical frameworks and goals, and they don't work together well. You know, you talk to practitioners and they struggle, and we need to address the data sharing challenges, which they don't do across the systems at all level. Limitations, it's data that comes to the attention of the system, accurate recording of the data, simplistic conceptualizations, so you're either or, offend either or, child maltreatment either or, mental health. I mean, we know that these are very complex concepts and need to be unpacked a lot further. Advantages, of course, is this is longitudinal population data, so this is everybody. It's data about vulnerable populations. It's very difficult to get longitudinal data about Indigenous people on standard survey methodologies. My next steps are to explore why some people with mental illness do not offend, explore the nature of the offending amongst people with mental illness. Is it public order? Is it violence? Explore the prison population experiences of child maltreatment and mental illness, and examine the spatial distribution, concentrated disadvantage inequalities across the overlaps. Special thanks to my data linkage people, Queensland Government Statistician Officer and Queensland Health Statistical Analysis and Linkage Unit. And thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and bang on 25 minutes.
Yeah,
Well
I was racing towards the end. I was watching. That's quite scary, watching that countdown.
We have some time for some questions now, if anyone has any. Yeah, so we'll start with the one next to you, Vin, and we'll have time for all 3.
Thank you. I just had a question about how you were showing that obviously the cumulative disadvantage between child protection and health and criminal justice overlapping. I suppose now that we know, but you've proven it again, that interface together has a really, I suppose, dismal result that devastates people, communities, our population broader. How, I suppose, do you have any ideas about how we could more closely work together, work cohesively, or what kind of a hierarchy is in place as to where the value is? Because I suppose I'm coming from a health background and I clearly see that criminal justice trumps health, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but in terms of the way some things roll out, that is what happens. And I suppose the outcome of that can be really devastating.
Criminal justice trumps mental health, but I don't think it trumps physical health. Yeah, I think that the amount of money we pour into hospitals and, you know, but anyway, that's a different argument.
Yeah, my perspective is from once you're in the criminal justice system, I suppose.
Oh yes, once you're in the criminal justice system. Oh yeah, no. I suppose my interest is how can we work within the mental health system to stop people getting into the criminal justice system, rather than how we work with mentally ill people in the criminal justice system. So what I'm trying really strongly to show is the fact that if we do put time and energy into both child protection prevention and managing mentally ill people in the community appropriately, we will prevent people from getting caught up in the criminal justice system and then churning, because that's what they do, is they churn through the criminal justice system. So that's where my focus. So now I'm not answering your question.
No, but you've made it clearer that that's you're
Yeah.
focusing on the prevention opposed to once it's already happened.
And what I know from my previous work is that, you know, the more child protection notifications and substantiations you have, the more likely you are to get caught up in the criminal justice system. And my guess is will be similar, although it's really hard. You know, these people they're starting to have contact for a hospital admission after the age of 4, I'm looking at. So we're going 4 through to, 16, which is initiation of offending, really. We have almost 50% of them sitting in that group, having had a hospital admission before the age of 16, and then going on to offend. I mean, what an opportunity, but not an opportunity that we are actually conceptualising as a crime prevention opportunity, a lever, a mechanism. I'm not sure how it works, but one of those levers we could get before people get into the system and start to work the churn that ends up in prison. Sorry, Hamish, I just about...
Thank you.
That's all right.
Thank you.
That's all right. I unfortunately think we did start a little bit late, so I think we've run out of time for more questions. So thank you again, Anna, and sorry for those people waiting.
I'm happy to answer questions after.